to show that just to remind us that we're in Epiphany, and Epiphany is about the light of God dawning upon the world, and that we're part of that. This light has shone upon us, and we're part of that. There's a couple of other things I really like about the video, little clips. And it's one of these that every time I watch, I spot other new things. But, you noticed, that you had a Chinese speaker reading the text, which I think is always amazing to hear the Bible read by someone who speaks another language, just to let you know how diverse and big the church is. But this scene here where it says it stopped over the place where the child was, you've got that farm light right there by the barn, and I think it encapsulates. And the other one I liked was, and they were overwhelmed with joy. Could you imagine these guys, put it in contemporary sense. You take some of the wisest advisors from Iran. They travel all the way over to Iowa to find this promised king. And where does the star lead them? Yeah, well, probably on Virgin Atlantic, but if it's today. But where does it lead them? It leads them to a barn. I mean, these wise guys have got to be absolutely nuts. Are they delirious or something? I mean, you don't go worship a king in a stable. I mean, that is not where you find kings. But they were overwhelmed with great joy. I'm not sure if they're, happy to be off the back of the camel. Oh, it's over. Let me off this stupid thing. Or that they actually saw something there that human eyes couldn't see. That they actually perceived that in this baby was the light of the world that was dawning on mankind. So I wanted to kind of remind us that we're in Epiphany. Epiphany is coming to an end because now we're moving into Lent, which it has a very, very different flavor to it. So as we're looking at Epiphany, Epiphany means unveiling, bringing to light, showing something forth, uncovering something. And that's what the wise men realized about Jesus. So as we look at these readings, one of the big questions is, why are these texts read during the season of Epiphany? Well, with the story of Joseph, it comes right in the first line where we have this picked up. Now remember Joseph, I have to kind of back up here. Joseph is the son of Judah. He's got two sons. He's got two wives, Rachel and Leah. And Rachel has only had two sons, Joseph and Benjamin. And so Leah, the wife he really didn't want to marry, theoretically, ended up having 10 sons. And so Joseph is kind of special. And then while his other brothers are out working in the field, he comes along and shows up out there and he says, hey, I had this great vision. You guys are all going to bow down and worship me. And they're like, we've had it with this dreamer. And there's also probably some family dynamics going on in there that, this is probably not the most healthy family at home. Because for the brothers then to beat and throw him into a well and sell him as a slave and then go back and deceive their father about it, kind of lets you know a little bit about what's going on inside that family there. And so Joseph has now been sold into slavery in Egypt. He's been down there a number of years. You remember the whole thing with Potiphar's wife who tries to seduce him. He refuses. She grabs his cloak and then basically has him thrown in prison for false sexual assault. Then, while he's in prison, you have the bakers and other people that he interprets a dream for him. Finally, this word gets taken to Pharaoh, and he ends up becoming Pharaoh's advisor. In fact, in this text that we read today, it says, I've become like a father to Pharaoh. And this is one of these statements in the ancient Near East that the advisors to the kings or the emperors were called fathers to them. So when he says, I've become like a father to Pharaoh, that's a statement out of the ancient Near East that I'm one of his chief advisors. Now, I'm not going to read the whole story here just for the sake of time. But there's a couple of things that are really important in this story. And they're going to line up with two of the other readings today. It's going to line up with Psalm 37, and it's going to line up with Luke chapter 6. 1 Corinthians 15, which is one of my favorite sections of the entire Bible, is on the resurrection, and I'm not quite sure why 1 Corinthians got sliced into the Epiphany readings, because oftentimes the texts don't line up with the other three. I think it's more to have a comprehensive view of the Bible that they put in, but if you know of some references where, or it could have been, somebody, it's like Karl Barth, when the German church was trying to figure out what we're going to do with Hitler and his claims and his rise to power, and they were forming the Confessing Church. Karl Barth was one of the main voices in forming that. And they asked him, well, how did you do it? And he said, well, I drank stronger coffee than anybody else did. The whole thing is, everybody else got tired of debating, and they're kind of tuckered out by the end of the day. And then he's, I'll edit that. I'll write that up for us. And so he gets to have the final voice on that whole thing. And now I don't know how I got off into that topic, but I know how I got there. Yeah, somebody writing the lectionary, everybody else was like, well, we're done. Dave, you go home and put the final draft on this. And it's like, I love 1 Corinthians, so that's going in here. But so the three texts that line up and that go way back to the earliest church are Joseph's story, Psalm 37, and then Luke chapter 6. And I'll show you how this all fits together. So we pick up the story here where Joseph's brother, because of the famine, have come down to Egypt to get help. And then he's pulled this trick with he's fed them, but he put his silver cup in his brother Benjamin, his only other brother from Rachel, in his chalice, sent him off. Then he sent his soldier after him. Why have you stolen from me? They catch him, and this kid's supposed to be killed. And the oldest brother, Judah, is pleading, if you take Benjamin and we cannot bring him back to our father is going to die. And I've given my life as a promise to my father that I would protect Benjamin. You can't do this. And Joseph has to go in another room, and he cries. Then he cleans up, and he comes back out to them and like, this is the weirdest Egyptian official we've ever run into. He threatens you, he feeds you, he has to run out of the room, he comes back. And so he comes back. And when he comes back, Jesus said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers couldn't answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. You can imagine, this story's getting weirder by the moment for them. And so Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came near, and he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Okay? Now imagine, you're a teenager, and your own brothers beat you, bind you up, and sell you as a slave to foreigners. And you're just carried off. And the whole thing is, we really can't imagine that today. But it gets done all the time. And a lot of those people are right here in Colorado Springs, because they have families in Southeast Asia or in Latin America where the family owes money. And so what do? They take the young women from the family, and they say, okay, she's going to go up to the United States, and she's going to work cleaning houses or hotel rooms. And they ship them here, but then they don't work in houses or hotel rooms. A lot of times you see it right out in plain sight. The other side of Powers, the east side of Powers Boulevard, you drive up and you see all those massage shops. A lot of those are women that have been brought from Southeast Asia over here for that purpose. On the Hispanic side, they're kept more on the land low. But anyways, here's Joseph. He's sold into Egypt. And then when he's in Egypt, he ends up in prison. I mean, this kid's life goes from bad to worse constantly through this whole thing. And he knows it. I am Joseph, whom you sold into slavery. Verse 5, now don't be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here, okay, twice. You sold me here, but look at this. For God sent me. And then in this passage, we're going to have three statements of this God sent me. So, God sent me. Come here. Let me see if it's going to bring it up. Yes. So I've got you sent me. The God sent me's are in blue. They're not showing up quite as well on this screen as they do on my iPad here. But you get this huge divergence between his brothers meant this for evil. They wanted to get rid of this kid. But on the other hand, God sent me. God sent me. God sent me. Now imagine the attitude it takes that if you are sold as a slave, and then as if being a slave isn't bad enough, you end up in prison. And in the midst of all that, you're able to look and see what God is doing in and through your life. Rick Warren, in his book, The Purpose-Driven Life, has a great, it's the one statement I love to quote out of it. And it's this: it's not about you, it's about God. To really have that perspective, and Joseph embodies this, that his brothers sold him, but that's not where his focus was. His focus was on God sent me, God sent me, God sent me. And the result is not only did he spare Egypt from famine, but then he was able to save his very own family in the process there. This complete reversal of everything that takes place here. Central to the whole story of Joseph is this idea of how God overrules human affairs. All too often when we face struggles or challenges, we take it personally. We only look at what's going on within our perspective. The amazing thing about Joseph and his story is that he's able to see beyond himself. He's able to sit back and ask, what is God doing here in my life in this situation? How is God using me in the midst of all this? Now from here, we move into Psalm 137. And Psalm 137 is a really interesting psalm because I was talking a little last week about how the Psalms, they were individual songs that were written down and then were compiled and grouped together. So you've got books within the book of Psalms, you've got songs of ascent, you've got royal songs, you've got songs of lament where you're sorrowful for various things. But then you also have very interesting psalms like Psalm 37. And when you read it, you go, this really belongs in the book of Proverbs. It's more wisdom than it is a psalm. And it's probably one of these things that reflects that you've got probably two different people. Somebody over here who's a really wise man is compiling the book of Proverbs, and somebody else who works in the temple and the worship service is compiling the book of Psalms. And so the guy in Psalms goes, oh, this is way too good for those guys over there, those wise guys to have in their book. It's got to go in the book of Psalms. And so he gets it written down first or drinks stronger coffee than the other guys. But Psalm 37 gets written. And as Robert McLeod was preaching this morning, as we move from here into Luke, these are really hard passages to teach because they affect and touch on our interpersonal life so much. Another thing about Psalm 37 that's very interesting, and this is just, for those of you who are really interested into it, is that this is what we call an acrostic psalm. Is that every line in the Hebrew begins with a new letter of the alphabet. So Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, along that line. And I put it up there so you can have the Hebrew letter Aleph and then how you would pronounce it. And Aleph and then the next letter Bet, this is where we get alphabet from. AB, this is, we get it off the Hebrew alphabet. Now, in this acrostic, what we have here is sort of the inner attitude that I think Joseph embodied in his life. In other words, the reason why these line up so well is because the way Joseph lived and the way he matured in his life, I think, is an exemplification of what Psalm 37 talks about. So, looking at this psalm. Now, I left the paragraph marks here because this is where the new letter of the Hebrew alphabet would fall, and it really, they're markers to show you where a complete thought is. And each one begins with the major verbal idea of that passage. So the first one is, fret not yourselves because of evildoers. Now, in the Hebrew, this word Fretting talks about this idea of burning up or being angry or raging about something or someone else, like that driver who pulls you off on the side of the road. I always imagine myself being Bruce Lee, jumping from the hood of my car to the back of their car. And I'll teach them, And then about 5 minutes later, I realize I'm not paying attention to how I'm driving, and I'm the dangerous one on the road here. But it's this idea you're consumed about what this other person has done or said or whatever. So the first piece of advice here is don't go down that road. Don't fret about it. Don't get burned up over it. Don't allow your emotions to get taken away. The next idea, where the bait in the Hebrew alphabet comes, this is trust in the Lord and do good and dwell in the land. This trusting in the Lord is really turning our attention from that person who wronged or did that evil, and instead focusing on the one who does good, God. You got a choice here. You can either fret about them, or you can turn your attention to this person. One of the things that's interesting, one of the things that's interesting that they kind of learned recently is this whole idea of multitasking. It's really a myth. It came out during the 1970s, this idea of corporations and leadership and multitasking, how to get things done. What they found is we really have split attention. In other words, you can pay attention here, and then you can flip here, but then you can flip back again. So you're splitting your attention between different things. And this is why using a cell phone when you're driving or doing other different things like that, it just doesn't work, because you're putting your attention here, you're putting your attention there. Or like me, imagining you're Bruce Lee, and you're thinking about that, but you're not thinking about driving. Actually, it's really interesting on the female side. With pregnancy, the hormones and the receptors within the brain changes. And so what happens is within the female mind is that split attention is increased. And there's probably just a simple biological reason for this, is that as a mother, you've got to pay attention to a lot more things than yourselves, especially the life of the young child. So constantly flipping back and forth. And this is why a lot of women, after giving birth, they go, I just can't concentrate on things. I can't keep my focus. I feel like I'm, all over the place, and it's because the way the hormonal receptors in the brain have actually changed. Guys just get old. Women change and move into new models of themselves. It's kind of unfair. Nice try, yes. But we're all going to die, though, right? So who cares? No. Yes. Yeah. So trust in the Lord. In other words, you're moving your attention off the fretting to trusting the Lord. Committing your ways to them. Imagine what it took on Joseph's part to commit his ways to the Lord when he was thrown into that well, or when the Midians are taking him down to Egypt to sell him, or when the Egyptians buy him, or when he gets thrown into prison in Egypt. To constantly keep committing himself to the Lord and trusting in God through that situation really took some remarkable spiritual fortitude on his part. I think also when you go back and you read the book of Genesis and you look at the story of Joseph, as you read through it, you see little hints where this wasn't kind of like something he did immediately when he was a teenager and first sold off. You actually see a growth process taking place. The fact that when he reveals himself, or he's about to reveal himself, and he has to run out of the room because he's crying and coming back in, I think lets you know that there is still, he hasn't fully arrived. There's still this big emotional struggle that's taking place within his life. Moving on to the next few verses here. Oh, wait a second, I forgot to do my, highlighting the words here. Come on. Delight. Oh, delight yourself in the Lord. I forgot that one. Delight yourself in God. Why? It's simple, because he cares for you and he's concerned about you. And he's not just concerned about you, but he's concerned about the wider context in which you find yourself. He cares about the other people around you as well. Then we move into verses 7 through 10. Let me see. Be still before the Lord. This is perhaps the opposite verb of fretting. The idea of being still is completely opposite than fretting. And it's one of these things where you kind of go, okay, this is almost a Buddhist statement in the book of Psalms here, this whole idea of quieting and stilling yourself. But it's very, very interesting. How many people here have an Apple Watch? Apple Watch. Yeah. One of the things that a lot of people find very frustrating on it is this Breathe app. Okay? It reminds you, take a breath now, and you're supposed to take a minute and do like 6 really deep breaths, so about 10 seconds each one. And a lot of people dismiss them. It's really interesting because a psychologist got that put in. He works for Apple. He does like design stuff, but he's got a PhD in psychology. And he fought tooth and nail to get this thing put in there. And then they've been doing research on it. The whole idea of just sitting down, stopping, and then just taking 6 deep breaths has a really remarkable effect on how you approach that day. And what it is, it's a kind of a rediscovery of what the psalmist is saying here. Be still. Now, in their culture, in their world, where you had about 10 to 12 hours a day where you could do work. And it wasn't high-paced. If you wanted to go somewhere, you had to walk there. If you wanted a meal, you had to go kill it or get it out of the field and then cook it. A much slower pace. For them to even say in that culture, in that context, to be still, I think really, should be like in big, bold letters like they used to do the old illuminated manuscripts, like a big, letter B, there on the side. Be still. Like I showed you last week, the cover of the book of Psalms from the medieval lectionary, the big Beatus right there on the start. Be still before the Lord. And refrain from anger. Forsake wrath. This is more the positive side. That, to put these things away from your life. Then one other thing that we need to look at here. Oh, no. It went back. I wanted to talk about, it's kind of picking up a divine attitude here. At the very start it says, for the evildoer, don't fret about them, because consider their ways. They are like grass that flowers, but then withers and is remembered no longer. So you're taking a longer time frame, rather than that little snapshot where you feel that they're an evildoer, to really consider the long frame. In contrast to that, where it talks about commit your ways to the Lord, for he cares for you, and you shall dwell in the land. You have a long-term habitation on our part that picks this up and carries it over. Now, when we come over to Luke chapter 6, in the Sermon on the Mount, we see a lot of these ideas. It's almost as if Jesus is preaching this sermon. He's drawing from the story of Joseph, and he's drawing from Psalm 37 when he teaches this. He starts off this where he says, but I say to you, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. And that shouldn't be spray. That should be pray. Pray for those who abuse you. What happens here is I copy the text, the ESV text, out of Accordance Bible Software and bring it over. But then the ESV text has these little notes. And the notes start off A, B, C, D. They go alphabetically through. So I just go, okay, there's note A, delete that. Note B, delete that. But every now and then, one comes through here. Now, one of the things I think that's really challenging about all this is that within our culture, this idea of loving your enemies, doing good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who abuse you, is so antithetical to our values. I think perhaps the best example of someone who's exactly opposite of this is Trump. He's known for saying is that when somebody says something bad about me, I hit them back 10 times harder. Okay? That is the exact opposite of the biblical attitude. And what we have here is something that is really difficult for us to practice, because what do we do when we get wronged? We want, if you have money, you launch a lawsuit. If you're not, you say nasty things, you do bad things or whatever. We always want to get retribution, and our culture, the American culture, really embodies this. All you have to do is watch all these Western movies or, the Bruce Willis Die Hard films or anything like this. It's always about retribution and getting your own. It's never about somebody who goes over and blesses and prays for them and loves them or does any sort of thing like this. I can't think of a single movie where what Jesus is talking about here is embodied. Les Mis, yes. And then I just thought of another one, the old Jimmy Stewart, the man who shot Liberty Valance. You have Jimmy Stewart and John Wayne. John Wayne is the guy who shoots him, but he's not the hero. It's Jimmy Stewart who's the guy who taught forgiveness and all these things. It moves on here. I'm going to go to the very end here. It says, be merciful even as your Father is merciful. This is the whole point of this, is that we're to be merciful, we're to forgive, we're to love, we're to pray for those who curse us, we're to bless those who abuse us. We're to embody this attitude. Why? Because our Father is merciful, therefore we're to be merciful. And this is really based on an ancient Middle Eastern, and even still today a Middle Eastern idea, that the child is to be like the father, and if the child doesn't live or embody the values of the father, then they're bringing dishonor upon that father and his household as well. So for us not to be merciful brings across the idea that we're then bringing dishonor and shame upon God, because God's a merciful God, and if his children are not merciful, then that really brings dishonor upon him. And you hear this a lot of times when people talk about Christians having a Pharisaical attitude, or that they're uptight, or they're this or that. And it's really because the church has not oftentimes embodied this attitude. So these three stories, three texts, Joseph, who embodies it and demonstrates it, Psalm 37, which really gives us the attitude and how to follow things, and then Jesus' sermon, which really lays down the gauntlet on it. And I don't have to talk a lot about it because I think Robert does a great job in the sermon this morning on explaining it. These really give us a huge challenge. Now, the one thing I wanted to just say by way of closing is, how do you embody these things? How do you actually go about making this a practice? Because it's really easy on the one hand to say, oh, this is what it's all about. But then how do you actually do it? And I think this is one of the areas where, if we go back to the medieval church, and they would practice this what they called illumination. It didn't just go in the text, but they did it in their lives as well. And illumination was the concept by where the Bible would become a light within their lives. And the way they would do it is they would take something like Psalm 37. So I don't have mine here anymore. But where it says, fret not about evildoers. What they would say is they would take that psalm and then pray. God, help me not to fret about this. Commit your way unto the Lord. God, help me commit my path and my life at this time unto you. Trust in the Lord. God, help me to trust. And they would take the Psalms, and instead of just having it as a text, they would just transfer it over to a first-person prayer. And then by doing that, it would illuminate their life. All of a sudden now, as they're reading and they're praying through this text, it's like light would open in their lives, and they're like, oh, Now I know what I need to do. I need to go talk to Father Joseph and tell him I'm sorry about what he did. Oh, the problem is I took a vow of silence for the next 20 years. Okay, I'm going to have to write this down somewhere. But that's the basic idea of this process of illumination. I think it's a great way to help take these stories and then bring it over into our lives. And so Psalm 37 becomes a very, very helpful tool to help us transform, but also become a spiritual practice within our lives. I'm actually going to close here today because we've got 10 minutes before service. And this way, we can actually have a little bit of time to get a little bit of coffee. And as normal, if you have any questions about the text or what we've gone through or anything like that, I'm more than willing to answer questions or talk with you more over in the fellowship hall. Okay? So we'll end there. Oh, I had one final picture for us, too. Yes. Yeah, so Joseph revealing himself from the brothers. Trivia quiz here. Why are only two of the brothers hugging? It's Benjamin and Joseph, and what's the textual evidence for Joseph's story? You can go back and read the story. There's actually one sentence in the story that lets you know why he has Benjamin and Joseph hugging. And we'll just leave it. You know, it's like the news quiz or puzzle time or something like that. We'll see if you can't find it. You're welcome. Here, wait a minute.